Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Teacher Leader Cohort Hangout on Air for our project-based learning unit. We're so glad to have you guys either joining us live or if you're watching it later, welcome. As we're going through today, we have a special guest with us, and I'll let him introduce himself in a second, but just want to introduce myself again. I'm Tracy Purdy, the Director of Online Learning, and we also have Dominique. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you online. Dominic Dines. I live down in Guadalajara, Mexico, and it's been fun getting to know you through our online community.
Yes, awesome. So hopefully we'll have a lot of you guys joining us. And as you're joining us, also follow us on the EdTechTeam Online hashtag on Twitter and tweet out anything that you're learning or any questions that you have. You also, please introduce yourself on the YouTube page at the bottom and ask any questions there. And Dominique will be monitoring that and jumping in with questions as we go. So today we are talking about project-based learning, and we have a special guest, somebody who I look up to whenever I think about project-based learning, somebody who has definitely inspired a lot of educators and made a difference in a ton of students' lives by allowing them to use project-based learning and other types of project-based learning in their classroom. So Kevin Brookhouser, would you introduce yourself to start?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, my name is Kevin Brookhouser. I'm a teacher at York School, which is a small school in Monterey, California. My background is mostly in teaching history and English, although I've kind of converted into teaching more specifically project-based learning and technology classes.
Awesome.
But, you ready to jump right in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would love for you either to take it away or to start, in your opinion, sharing what project-based learning is. So take it away.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start by kind of talking about how I saw myself as a teacher when I got out of college and kind of thought what my role would be. I modeled a lot of my teaching career after some of the great teachers that I had growing up, and what I loved about the teacher. So a lot of my education was I got this head that was full of knowledge, and this happened kind of in the mid 90s, early 90s when I graduated from high school and college. And I thought that my job was going to be to just kind of fill kids' heads with knowledge the way a lot of my teachers did with mine. But then, you know, the internet came around and I started to question how important it was for me to do that. And then I, you know, as I got further along in my career, I started spending more time kind of worried about some of the really big problems that our world faces. And especially now that I have my own children of my own, I started worrying about these problems even more and more, and thinking, you know, feeling anxious about all these problems that we have, and thinking about how am I going to go about being the one who solves all these problems. And I finally came to the conclusion that I don't think I'm going to solve the world's problems all on my own, but I do feel really fortunate that I am a teacher. And I can spend the time that I have with my students to get them to think of themselves as the people who are going to solve the world's big problems out there. And so I really decided that I was going to transform my career from one whose job was to fill my students' heads full of knowledge to one where my job was really to get my students to think of themselves as solving the world's problems. You know, I think you can divide the kind of work that we do in the classroom into two categories. One is that it is getting students to solve problems that have already been solved, and getting students to solve problems that have not yet been solved. So the first of those I would call like algorithmic problem solving. So, you know, if you want your kids to learn how to know how to solve problems, they need to know how to follow certain formulas in order to solve those problems. So let's get out of theory for a second and say, all right, well, I've got a kid and he needs to know how tall that building is, and he doesn't have a tape measure to reach the top of that building, or a ladder or an elevator to get up to the top of that building. Well, you can apply some math in order to solve that problem. If you can figure out the angle of between yourself and the top of that building, and you can measure the distance between yourself and the base of that building, well, you can apply the Pythagorean theorem and solve that problem. So Pythagoras gave us that solution to that problem, and if students know how to use that solution, that's great. You need to figure out what's the force of an object. Just watching the that launch yesterday. Did you guys watch the Falcon Heavy launch? You know, in order to accomplish what they did, they need to use Newtonian and even I assume some physics from Einstein as well. Basically, apply a bunch of formulas in order to get that rocket up in space. But what's really inspiring about what Elon Musk is doing with that rocket launch is he's figuring out how to solve problems, not just using formulas that have already existed, but he's creating solutions on his own as well. And I think that we're going to need a combination of following pre-established formulas, and we're also going to need a group of a mass of individuals, our students, who are going to be able to solve problems that don't yet have solutions. And that's that latter half is really where I'm kind of focusing my energy. So I'm always looking for opportunities to give my students problems that don't come pre-packaged with solutions. You know, if there's, I found in the real world, there's not an answer key at the back of the book, right? We don't know how to solve the problems that we're really faced with, so we need to know how to go about attempting to create our own solutions. So that's where I've spent a lot of time. Let me share with you a slideshow here and dive in a little deeper. And if you have any thoughts, Dominique or Tracy, feel free to chime in or questions.
Kevin, I think that's a great way to frame thinking about project-based learning for sure, is making sure you're getting them that ungoogleable question, or that question that you know, there isn't necessarily an answer to, and they have to figure that out. So that's what our cohort members are trying to think about, and trying to think about what are those kind of questions, those driving questions that I can give my students to have them create some kind of new answer.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let's dive in a little deeper into how we go about establishing these questions. First of all, I want to highly recommend to you all this book called Drive by Daniel Pink. It is really what has motivated me to rethink how I go about framing my classroom. But and that book is not really intended for educators. It's more intended for managers and entrepreneurs to try to motivate their employees and their teams to solve problems in creative ways. And I think the insight that he reveals is that if companies provide their teams more autonomy, that they'll get more creative students, or they'll get a more creative and more innovative workforce. And that's the three elements are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I really want to focus on that autonomy, giving individuals more freedom in how they spend their time and what they're doing. You know, Google has become, you know, this massive company that I admire a lot, but one of the big risks that they have of getting so big is that they run the risk of losing that culture of innovation that got them where they are. And so what Google does is they ask their employees to observe the world around them and think about problems that need to be solved. And if they see a problem that needs to be solved that's not necessarily within their job description, that they're given the resources at Google to solve those problems. And so that's what I do with my students in my classroom, is I ask my students to really go out into the world and look for problems that need to be solved. I want my students to have a constant mindset of curiosity. Why is the world the way it is? And what can we do about changing it? And so, like Google, who gives their employees what they call 20% time, the resources and time necessary to solve independent problems, I give my students the time and resources to solve any problem that they might observe. So like you said, Tracy, like, how do they go about coming up with those questions? one homework assignment that I give my students over a weekend is to go out with a camera. It's probably their cell phone camera, but I ask them to go out and take pictures of things that they observe that spark their curiosity. And often it raises these questions about why is the world the way it is, and why do these photos, why is this person smoking cigarettes on the recreation trail where we're supposed to be healthy? That was one example, and they came back with all of these photos that they took that made them kind of question the world as it was. And I asked them to go about and try to create solutions to any problems that they might have seen, following that Google 20% time model. And I've got a video that shows you some that we'll share out, that shows you some examples of what kind of problems that my students have attempted to solve by taking that on. But one of the things that came up is, and that always comes up when we ask students to take on autonomous problems, where we ask students to kind of come up with their own solutions or take on autonomous projects, is that a lot of students don't know how to respond to that kind of freedom, that kind of open-ended problem. So, I mean, one of the things I ask my students is, like, figure out a problem and go out there and solve it. And a lot of my students don't know even where to start, even after giving them that kind of curiosity and problem safari assignment. So I asked them to brainstorm ideas of, like, what could they do with some of the time that they have in my class to solve real world problems. And you guys know the number one rule of brainstorming regarding good ideas or bad ideas?
No idea is a bad idea.
That's right. No idea is a bad idea. And that works with teams that are open to coming up with these kind of wild ideas. But one thing that I've learned as a teacher is that my students are kind of moderately interested in the material that I'm learning, but what they're really worried about, what they're really concerned about, is not the material I'm teaching. Their number one concern is not embarrassing themselves in front of their peers, right? So if they are in a brainstorm session and they try to come up with a bunch of ideas, they believe that if they come up with some really off the wall and it turns out to be a dumb idea, well, they run the risk of being labeled as the one who came up with the dumb idea for the rest of that semester, right?
Yep, for sure.
So I found that my brainstorm sessions kind of always ended up kind of boring, because they come up with these really safe ideas. And the whole point of a brainstorm session is to come up with these wild ideas, right? So instead of allowing my students to come up with bad ideas during a brainstorm session, I decided to try to mandate it. And I forced my students to come up with bad ideas, and I called it the Bad Idea Factory.
I love that.
And for 20 minutes, I asked my students to, I said, your job is to change the world. And I want you to come up with the worst ideas that you can think of, that you can spend your time, that I'm going to provide you to change the world. And my students came up with some really, really awful ideas. No question about it. Ideas that I would never want implemented, like, to invent a new invasive species and send it out into the Monterey Bay. And, one kid who was trying to come up with a bad idea said, like, what was it? There were so many terrible ones. One was go to dances and try to break up everybody they could see who was dancing too close. Like, all these, like, really ridiculous ideas. But some of these bad ideas that started out seeming like they were bad ideas, when we discussed them, they turned out to be kind of interesting. Like, one girl said, I want to pretend to be pregnant and see how people treat me. Well, immediately I was like, I don't know if that's a bad idea. You want to try that and see what happens? And, Audrey was like, no, I don't want to do that. And anyway, from that idea, another kid came up with the idea of spending a month in a wheelchair and seeing what that would be like. And that turned out to be a really terrific idea. And so he ended up spending a week, or no, a month in a wheelchair, and really experiencing what that was like and documenting his results. And actually one of the results was we had a major transformation on our campus because he started to understand what our campus was like for people in wheelchairs. And he petitioned to install a sidewalk where there absolutely needed to be a sidewalk. So that was one method of generating the ideas.
I love that though, because it does it gives them the zone to say all ideas that they maybe were a little bit afraid to say before. So.
Yeah, it was a big difference between giving them permission to come up with bad ideas and actually saying, I want you to come up with bad ideas. And then they just went really silly. And, they found out through that experience that in my classroom that, hey, it was okay every once in a while to come up with a bad idea. But anyway, once those ideas get out, I really want them to focus their energy on creating a project. My goal for this is for them to actually do something that has a real world impact and have true project-based learning where they're doing something that affects other people. And I really want them to focus on their audience. So I have a proposal that I have them write. It's a template that I've provided on my website, and they answer a series of questions like who is the audience that their project is going to serve? What is a finished product going to look like? And how are they going to accomplish it based on their budget? Because I actually have no money to give my students for this project, but luckily we live in the era of the Chromebook where you can do a whole lot with very little money. It's amazing what you can produce with a Chromebook that you no longer need to ask someone's permission to write a book or produce a movie or create the next app. Like you can just do it now with a little bit of, watch some YouTube videos and learn how to do it, and then you just do it. So I asked them to come up with a timeline and work on it, and I have them blog every week about how their project is going, and I place a big emphasis on them completing the project. A lot of people ask me, how do you grade this project? Well, I don't grade it. I don't grade the final product itself, because I found that if you attach grades to the project, they tend to aim pretty low to make sure that that whatever they shoot for, that they hit that target. And I really want them to aim high, and that if they aim high and try something big and it doesn't turn out to be a complete success, then I think there's a massive amount of learning that can happen through that. So I don't grade the actual project. I grade the components of the project. So like I make sure that they're blogging every week, and I make sure that they submit a proposal and it meets my demands. And then I have them give a final presentation, and we model that final presentation after the TED conference, and I grade the final presentation. But I make sure that my students know that they don't need to create the perfect project by the end of the year. Because I know that if my students really shoot for perfection, that their work often just ends up being incomplete, because they're students. They're not going to be able to create the perfect project yet. They're still in that learning process. But I do want them to have a project that's done. And I want them to reflect upon that learning process. And that's why the presentation at the end that's modeled after the TED conference is so valuable.
Which, I mean, it's valuable beyond that, just in the preparing a presentation and public speaking and sharing your learning throughout the year. So what a great thing. Kevin, I'm wondering if you can just, to clarify for some people who are watching, do you do this as a separate class? What is the class structure? Is this, just time frame over the whole entire school year, so they can kind of wrap their mind around, how do I even do this? This sounds so awesome, but how do I even do this in my own classroom?
Yeah. So I started as doing this as an English teacher, and I was so excited about how Google frames it. They call it 20% time, right? So you can take portion of your time and work on this independent project. So I just kind of followed that model. And I said, all right, for my English class, 1 day a week, we're going to work on these independent projects. It was kind of like a secret, writing assignment. And so I had them work on their projects 1 day a week. For me, I found that if I chose a Tuesday, that was really effective for my students. I determined that if I made it on Friday, which is kind of a natural impulse, that people would think that it was just kind of like fun day. And I hope that their projects are fun, but that's definitely not the goal. And it's actually really hard work. It's one of the most rigorous assignments that I give my students. And I want them to know that I want them to take it seriously. So that's why I chose like a day on Tuesday. So that's how I frame it. I do it, spend a day a week working on these projects. And now it's gotten to the point where I'm now teaching a class that's basically 20-time projects. So we do it all day, every day now, which I kind of think is the future of education, is giving kids these real world projects. And then what we do is we make, if the academic content that we're teaching them in general is so important, then it would be at some point become critical to the projects that they're working on. So, for example, math, my students are creating budgets and they're doing data analysis of audience surveys. And so in order for them to really understand how to do that effectively, they need certain math skills. So I find I'm looking for natural ways and more authentic ways to integrate the academic standards that we need our students to learn into the projects.
Awesome. Fantastic. Dominique, let's turn it over to you for a second, see what people are saying on the feed. Any questions that have come in?
Yeah, we have a few people watching with us today. And one question that came in is, Roxy says, I get the 20% time project because students can choose their topic. But how do we get the same enthusiasm when we're creating PBLs that meet specific state standards?
Yeah, I think I missed a critical word. What did you say right before enthusiasm?
The same. Like, because students are obviously excited about 20-time projects, but how can you do it, in the context of state standards?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I hope that the state standards and the most familiarity I have is with like the Common Core. In researching the Common Core, those sorts of state standards actually align really well towards independent projects. And so often I try to look for ways to manufacture those standards into the projects that I'm teaching them. So like I said, when one of the math standards is learning how to take a look at a data set and applying meaning out of that data set. Well, I require that my students survey their audience and really try to understand who that is. Now, as far as getting kids enthusiastic about the standards that don't fit into these kinds of projects, I hope that those standards, and what I like about the Common Core standards is that they're broad enough that they can fit into a wide variety of projects. Do you have any more thoughts on where I should go with that question?
One thing so with a lot of the driving questions that people are creating, they're doing a little bit more of starting with a more traditional project-based learning. And I think one of the things is just thinking about that content and that standard in a very different way, and creating a question that's not just a yes or no question, and creating creating an experience or something for students to do that is not just, remembering a fact, but actually diving into finding out why, or the questioning behind that. So maybe that answers the question a little bit more, but
should be tied in. Any of those standards should tie in pretty directly to something that's going on around the world and something that is important to them. I mean, you should be able to, I would imagine it'd be easier if I knew exactly what that standard was to like tie it into something that I think the kids could get excited about. But
yeah, she was saying specifically American history.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh my goodness.
So
yeah. Well, I mean, there's I've never been more interested in American history than I am right now, and more interested in the Constitution, because like we're seeing so much happen to our country and our country's, what our country's norms, and things are changing so much that we can look back at the history and see how maybe the conflict that we're experiencing right now in American history is new, or actually is not so new.
yeah, no, I definitely agree. So finding those things to tie it in, to make it interesting, or to make them research a question of like something that's going on today. What does that have to do with the rules that were made back in 17 whatever?
Right.
Thinking about those. Thanks, Kevin. Dominique, any other questions coming in?
Yeah, we just have one other one. Anna's asking, what's too short and what's too long a time frame for this unit? For
these kinds of projects, I wouldn't put a limit on those, but I'll tell you some sweet spots. I found as a high school teacher, I really think longer is better. That's why I like to make my projects year-long projects, because they have so little experience working on those long-term projects. So that's why mine begins in September and it ends in May. But I've worked with a lot of teachers of younger students who rightfully say, yeah, I don't think a fourth grader can handle that sort of long-term project. I would challenge teachers of younger kids to try to go for longer, but I've seen successful projects that last a few weeks and even shorter. What I find is the most important. Everything else is just kind of details that fit in. I think the two most important things are, one, that there is some level of autonomy. The students have some freedom about how they tackle that problem. And the other one is that there's a real purpose, that the projects that the students take on has an impact on an entity outside of themselves. So alongside 20-time projects, which is gaining a lot of momentum around education, there's also this other positive trend called Genius Hour, where teachers will give students a certain period of time to just kind of pursue their own passions. And I certainly think that there's some value to that, but it's not. Genius Hour doesn't necessarily have a purpose. If a kid just wants to learn to play the saxophone, in Genius Hour, that kid can just go learn to play the saxophone, which of course there's value in a kid learning to play the saxophone. But it doesn't fit within what I've been really hoping that teachers work on, and that is the purpose element. You want to learn to play the saxophone, that's great. But what sort of impact can you have by learning to play the saxophone? Who can you reach and who can you move? And when that kind of project becomes, well, I want to go to the local senior center and perform for them and give them a taste of live music, for a population that doesn't get exposure to a lot of live music, then there is that purpose. So that I spend a lot of time focusing on that.
That's awesome. Kevin, we so appreciate you coming and joining us right now. Dominique, any last thoughts from the chat, or?
We do actually have two quick questions for you, Kevin.
Yeah.
They just came in. How did you present this idea to your administration?
Oh, good question. I've got a letter that outlines how to pitch this to adults, and it's on my website, 20time.org/letter. But I will just quickly say, and of course, I've got a book here if you want to really dive in deep. If you look up the 20-time project, it goes into great depth of how to frame this sort of project and how to pitch it to stakeholders. One thing that I found is that with if I'm careful enough about how I explain it to administrators, and they understand why and how I'm doing it, I've never had a hard time convincing administrators to get on board. Every school leader that I've seen is pushing for more of these experiences in the classroom. It's a lot harder to sell this idea to, strangely, it's harder to sell it to teachers, and it's harder to sell it to students. But parents and administrators, they're pretty easy to convince.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. And then we have just one other question before we finish up.
Yeah.
What do you do if you make this a year-long project and you have students who say that I'm done or I'm finished and it's only January?
Yeah, good question. I don't think any project is finished. So if any project is fully finished. So either you can take that gem that you just created and polish it further, or you can say, all right, how can we scale this out to have a bigger impact on a larger audience? There's, no matter what it is that you're working on, make it bigger, do more good with it, reach a bigger audience.
Yeah, well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all we have for questions, Tracy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dominique. There was lots of chat going on in the back, Kevin, just so you know.
Oh, that's great.
And we just so appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise with us, because it just helps us to frame our minds. And, you know, as you said, our goal is definitely to empower our students to solve the world's problems. So thank you for that. If you guys want more information, Kevin has an incredible website, 20time.org, and he also has his book, The 20 Time Project. Make sure that you check those out, because they are full of resources for you. So Kevin, we truly appreciate you joining us, and good luck everyone with your own thinking about project-based learning, and reach out to us if you have any questions. Any last thoughts, Kevin?
Give it a try.
All right, perfect. All right, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you online soon.
See ya.